Alright guys, today we're going to watch a video about toxic algae, and we're looking kind of at the opposite effects from what we watched about the last one, which was, really good things about algae. So there are some questions in Canvas and you can follow along with the video for those.
July 2016. Above average rainfall in South Florida causes dangerously high water levels in South Central Florida's Lake Okeechobee. Flood control managers, fearing a breach in the dike surrounding the lake, release billions of gallons of water through canals, rivers, and streams into the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. The discharge to Florida's Atlantic coast surged down the C-44 canal that flows into the St. Lucie River and estuary and into the lower Indian River lagoon. It formed a toxic blue-green algae mat as much as 6 inches thick that shut down marinas and polluted nearshore waters as it flowed out the St. Lucie Inlet and into the ocean. Airborne toxins from the algae bloom sickened people and contaminated one of the most biologically diverse estuaries in North America.
We all suffered from the headaches, the hoarseness of your throat, and the smell that you couldn't get rid of once you went home at night. It was horrible, and we don't want to do it again.
I have very little business coming through the door. The phone stopped ringing. Nobody's using your boats. The water is just that nasty. Nobody wants to go out on it.
This has been making national news. It's going to have a devastating long-term impact just from an economical standpoint. My hopes is that they can figure out a way to stop the discharges to protect our estuaries, which we are slowly killing off.
Florida's coastal communities have struggled for decades with harmful algal blooms caused by seasonal freshwater discharges from Lake Okeechobee.
We've got to do something about this and hold the politicians responsible.
This is where the greatest damage is being done to the ocean as a whole. It's where humans and the ocean meet and interact, and it's the lifeblood of so much of the ocean.
In South Florida, algal blooms are a long-term problem with complex sources and solutions. Now, scientists, engineers, and water managers are pursuing restoration and rehabilitation strategies in response to one of America's complicated marine challenges.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Batchelor Foundation, encouraging people to preserve and protect America's underwater resources. And by Divers Direct, Emotion Sports, inspiring the pursuit of adventure and water sports. The Do Unto Others Trust. The William J. and Isabel G. Clark Foundation. And by the following: Lady Susanna P. Tweed and Carlton Tweed Charitable Foundation, Skip and Diane Day.
The Indian River Lagoon was once considered one of North America's most biologically diverse estuaries. It stretches more than 150 miles down Florida's Atlantic coast.
People don't realize what incredibly precious places estuaries are, because they are the nursery for the ocean. When fish and other organisms want to produce offspring, their offspring have a much better chance of surviving if they can do it in a place where there's hiding places and lots of food. So we have many organisms that spawn in the Indian River Lagoon that end up in Chesapeake Bay because they're carried by the Gulf Stream up the coast. So this is super, super precious territory.
Once a beautiful and thriving area, portions of the lagoon suffer periodically from mats of algae, often described as guacamole thick. To fully understand the complex sources and potential solutions to this algae crisis, it's necessary to look inland, to Florida's lakes and rivers, the Everglades, and man-made structures that regulate water on its journey to the sea.
Historically, water from the Kissimmee as far north as Orlando would flow down the Kissimmee Basin, filling up Lake Okeechobee, and water would spill over to the south into the Everglades during wet years. And that would replenish the marshes all the way down to Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. And we changed that by building the dike around Lake Okeechobee, with the need for flood control south of the lake as people moved into South Florida. And so now when the lake fills up in wet years, that water hits a barrier, that dike, and we have to divert it east to the St. Lucie and into the lower Indian River Lagoon and west to the Caloosahatchee River and out to the Gulf of Mexico.
And we've shut off the water to the Everglades, and now they are dying for lack of water. You can kind of think of Lake Okeechobee as the blue heart of Florida, and the waters flowing in and out of it is like the circulatory system. And we've kind of messed up the circulatory system for this state.
While the dike holds back the water to provide necessary flood control for people living south of the lake, it also accumulates pollutants from nearby agriculture, cattle farming, septic tank leaks, and other sources which can cause algal blooms in the lake.
So this shallow body of water has a layer of muck at the bottom that is very high in phosphorus and nitrogen content, such that when the wind blows, it's enough to stir up that muck and release that pollution into the water.
Algae need nutrients to grow, and so with nitrogen and phosphorus that's been coming into Lake Okeechobee from agriculture and cattle and septic systems, all of those nutrients are just feeding these algae, and it's just exploding in enormous numbers.
Nitrogen and phosphorus are naturally present in the water, but when higher concentrations are introduced from man-made sources, they're considered pollutants and fertilize algal growth that otherwise wouldn't have occurred.
What happens then is you've got all of this polluted fresh water that's being sent out in billions of gallons into this amazing estuary that was once designated one of the most biologically diverse estuaries in the United States. But it's loaded with nutrients and toxins. And so it's just this death knell for this once beautiful estuary.
So the algae bloom that we saw forming in the summer of 2016 in the St. Lucie estuary was sourced from Lake Okeechobee. It bloomed severely in Lake Okeechobee to the point where you could see it from commercial flights, you could see it from satellite images.
Several types of cyanobacteria are found in Florida's waters. Commonly referred to as algae or blue-green algae, they can form massive blooms when the light, temperature, and nutrient conditions are right.
So what we're getting is a tremendous amount of these discharge events, bringing with it this freshwater algae known as Microcystis aeruginosa. And that Microcystis algae, that blue-green algae, pervaded all throughout the St. Lucie estuary in the Indian River Lagoon south, and then also went out onto the nearshore reefs. And in fact, for the first time ever, the algae was so present on our public beaches, they had to close the beaches for several days for public safety.
It is a very serious concern. I thought we were reaching a tipping point in this estuary where it was very likely to become algae dominated. And I thought I knew what that meant, but this is so much worse than I could have ever envisioned that I really can't quite predict what's going to happen, because microcystis is just so nasty. So if you are anywhere near it, the impact on your health is immediate and severe, and it's clearly having the same impact on the organisms that are having to live actually in it.
The immediate effects of the 2016 bloom were felt by the people in coastal Martin County.
It affected our health. We couldn't breathe at night.
We had headaches.
How rude do you want me to get?
Phil Norman is co-owner of a small business with 5 employees.
Not to make a pun, but one was turning green and finally, vomited. So I'm like, go home. You don't need to be here. It's not worth it. Your health's not worth a job. You can always find another job somewhere doing something else.
Acute exposure can actually lead to a bleeding liver. Long-term exposure can lead to things like liver cancer. And then there's other toxins mixed in there with microcystin that we know less about. How much are the ecosystems as a whole being impacted? How much is microcystin being incorporated into the food web? Microcystin is a remarkably stable molecule. You can actually boil water and it doesn't impact microcystin. It's still fine. It still does its thing. So that's pretty alarming. And so how long it stays in the food web once it's taken up, how much it accumulates in things like shellfish and higher order predators, those are things that we really need to know a lot more about.
And microcystin isn't the only toxin of concern released by cyanobacteria during algal blooms in South Florida. University of Miami professor Larry Brand collects and analyzes water samples from the Atlantic and Gulf Coast estuaries, the Everglades, and Florida Bay to monitor nutrients that he believes generate large algal blooms.
We're about 2/3 of the way down from Lake Okeechobee. So this is the southern part of the Everglades. And the northern part is a source of high concentrations of nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus. Phosphorus causes problems in the Everglades themselves, altering the ecosystem.
While much of the Everglades' historic water flow has been diverted east and west of Lake Okeechobee, some of the polluted water still makes its way south across the water-starved River of Grass.
Eventually, the phosphorus gets filtered out by the Everglades, but so much nitrogen coming out of the northern third of the Everglades that it makes it all the way to Florida Bay, generates large algal blooms, which is the focus of my research, the cause of these large algal blooms that we're getting in Florida Bay as well as elsewhere in South Florida. We think we've discovered a compound that does not have any short-term effects but does have long-term effects. And the compound's called BMAA.
BMAA, or beta-methylamino L-alanine, is a small amino acid that potentially has serious health impacts for humans and animals. BMAA can be incorporated into the body by mimicking a major amino acid, serine. This can lead to malfunctioning and tangled proteins, which can be devastating to the brain.
And there's increasing evidence that can lead to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS. We started looking at concentration of BMAA in seafood here in South Florida. And the bottom line is we saw high levels of BMAA in, say, the pink shrimp in Florida Bay, blue crabs in Biscayne Bay, pufferfish in Biscayne Bay, etc. So places where we see these blooms of cyanobacteria, with green algae, we do find high concentrations of BMAA.
And BMAA wasn't just found in fish in Florida Bay.
I was able to get a permit to get brain tissue from dolphins that had died in Indian River Lagoon. Dolphins are at the very top of the food chain there, eating seafood just like we do. The autopsy could not find any cause of death. No known toxins or diseases, anything like that. But we found high levels of BMAA in their brains. And since then, I've talked to a couple of researchers who studied the behavior of dolphins in the Indian River Lagoon. And they told me they have seen some dolphins in the Indian River Lagoon that seem confused, getting lost, swimming up rivers, up into freshwater lakes, and so on. Sounds just like an Alzheimer's patient. So my concern here is if you get exposed to a cyanobacteria bloom and you don't have any immediate effects, you think, well, everything's okay. Well, maybe not.
While many researchers have documented the impact of algal blooms on human health and Florida's coastal estuaries, researchers are still studying what exactly causes them. Many blame pollutants from lawn fertilizers, agriculture, and cattle farming. But experts say it's not that simple.
What we see as being the major change here
is the rapid population growth, particularly in the northern Kissimmee area, which is a major source of not just stormwater runoff, but nutrients as well.
Dr. Brian LaPointe, a researcher at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, says in the case of the bloom affecting portions of the lower Indian River Lagoon, Florida's explosive population growth and the waste it produces is a significant problem.
This bloom followed major rainfall on the watershed of Lake Okeechobee to the north, where record rainfall fell in January and sporadically throughout the spring, right up through May and into June. That allowed for a lot of nutrient loading into Lake Okeechobee from the north of the lake. It's nitrogen in the form of nitrate. That was the dominant nutrient source, and a lot of that was coming from septic tanks.
Dr. LaPointe says septic tank systems are problematic in Florida because of the state's sandy, porous soils.
So you get very rapid movement of the septic tank effluent through the soils into the groundwater or the adjacent surface water. And in many places that I have worked, the water tables are so high that the drain fields during much of the year are sitting right in the groundwater.
Once the nitrogen-rich sewage enters the groundwater, it can quickly move downstream and create problems miles away. Dr. LaPointe collects and analyzes the tissues of different algae samples to trace the source of nitrogen that led to their growth.
We've got the grand slam today.
Hooray!
Unlike cyanobacteria, which aren't true algae, the algae that Dr. LaPointe studies are plant-like organisms.
We found the 3 target species that we were looking for. This is ulva, we've got hypnea, and we've got gracilaria. These are very fast-growing seaweeds that we analyze for stable nitrogen isotopes. That allows us to identify the source of nitrogen that's fueling the algal blooms in the Indian River Lagoon.
We use a method here in my laboratory by measuring nitrogen isotopes in the algae themselves. It can tell us whether that nitrogen is from human sewage or from fertilizers.
Dr. LaPointe's research concluded that there was a lot more human excrement in the water than previously thought, accounting for up to 60% of the nitrogen in some areas. And he believes septic tanks were to blame.
What we found is that all these canals and tributaries right here on the main stem of the Indian River Lagoon locally are surrounded by homes, and many of these have septic tanks that are sitting right in the groundwater. And there are estimates ranging from 300,000 to 600,000 septic tanks up and down the Indian River Lagoon. This is the Space Coast. We put a man on the moon, yet we can't really clean up, our own waste coming out of our backyards. So, there's a problem here.
Many experts believe that so long as polluted water continues to be released into the estuaries, seasonal algal blooms will continue.
What we've seen over the years with the repeated discharge of polluted water from Lake Okeechobee, not only in the St. Lucie estuary, but also in the Caloosahatchee on the west coast, is that they are being hammered repeatedly. Every couple of years we have these discharge events. So really the system never quite recovers from the previous disturbance.
Okay, so what do? There's no short-term fix in sight. We've been saying for years that water needs to be diverted back south to the Everglades again, but first it has to be cleaned up, which means they have to have land that they can hold it on. So it's going to be a long time, even if they finally get around to doing what we've been asking them to do for all these years, before they can fix it.
efforts are underway to clean up the water coming out of Lake Okeechobee before it reaches the Everglades and the estuaries. Stormwater treatment areas are put in place near the lake to help filter nutrients out of the water that lead to excessive algal blooms and other problems. One of these reservoirs is the C-44 stormwater treatment area being constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Scheduled for completion by 2020, it will filter the water released from Lake Okeechobee as it moves east, before it reaches the St. Lucie estuary.
When in full operations, the project will pull water from the C-44 canal. As it moves through the treatment cells, we use natural biological processes, in other words, vegetation. Plants will start growing up in the treatment cells, and through their growth and their natural processes, they'll absorb some of the nutrients, whether it's phosphorus or nitrogen, and pull those nutrients out of the water column, so the water that goes out the other end of the treatment cell is cleaner than it was then when it came in.
Everglades restoration came about because we realized some of the unintended consequences of managing water across southern Florida was detrimental to the environment. So we are maintaining flood control, water supply, and other water-related needs of the region while balancing it with benefits to the natural environment.
Signed into law in 2000, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was devised to protect and restore the water resources of Central and South Florida. Its goals include capturing and filtering the fresh water that is currently diverted from Lake Okeechobee to the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, and redirecting it south to the Everglades, where it's needed most. While the plan is designed to benefit the Everglades ecosystem, it's also expected to cut the frequency and extent of toxic algal blooms in South Florida's estuaries.
So here we are 10, 15 years into the process. We have a number of projects that are already underway, C-44 being one of them. I think that if we stay the course and we continue to construct storage and water quality treatment projects, as we get those projects funded and constructed and online and operational, that will be the solution.
Everglades restoration is really a long-term endeavor. Originally, the concept was for a 30-year plan, and that would have been with ideal funding and really no stumbling blocks along the way. However, it's very complicated.
Ultimately, there's a lot of politics involved. As it is now, it's many billions of dollars, so I'm kind of skeptical at this point. Been a lot of political battles over the last 20 years over this. It doesn't seem to be subsiding, or we've not made a whole lot of progress, actually.
One of our biggest problems is that we have a political system that means that we generally have short-term appointments for critical positions. And in fact, we've added to that by having term limits, so that just about the time somebody's getting good at their job, they're thrown out of it. So we don't have people that have the long view. They're working in the short term.
None of the water management decisions that the Corps makes are easy ones. This is a very complicated system, and it's incredibly challenging to balance all of the water-related needs of the region. And we are very sympathetic and understand that the decisions that we make have significant impacts. And we work with all of the stakeholders in order to try and minimize those impacts at every available opportunity.
We really have to be forward-thinking and look at Florida's water future. We have 1,000 people a day moving to Florida now. We're the number one tourist destination in the world. 105 million tourists came to Florida last year. Nothing is going to be sustainable about that population growth if you cannot deal with the wastewater, the sewage that they're producing.
Countless challenges remain. Experts are working to better understand the impacts of toxic algal blooms and what needs to be done to prevent them in the future. Meanwhile, many stakeholders believe that truly solving this complex problem will require not only technological ingenuity, but also political will.
We have to stop the circular firing squad where everybody points to the next guy and says, it's not me, it's him, and therefore nothing gets done. And the politicians say, well, we really can't answer that without more studies, and then they don't fund the studies. And you just get nothing happening. And now you've got people getting sick and no end in sight. So we need to get smart about these things nationwide and worldwide.
Don't forget about this. This has been occurring. It's been occurring for 20 years. It's not going to go away unless we keep applying pressure to the politicians. And it's not going to happen until the general public sits up and says, listen, we need to get this done. Period.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Batchelor Foundation, encouraging people to preserve and protect America's underwater resources. And by Divers Direct, Emotion Sports, inspiring the pursuit of adventure and water sports. The Do Unto Others Trust. The William J. and Isabel G. Clark Foundation. And by the following: Lady Susanna P. Tweed and Carlton Tweed Charitable Foundation. Skip and Diane Day.
Alrighty guys, I thought that was a pretty interesting video, just a little bit of a different take. We talked about how great algae are for our health, and now we're hearing about how toxic and how dangerous they can be. So it really just depends on the species and I guess where you're located as to how good algae is for you or how bad it is. And hopefully you'll do your part as well in trying to keep everything nice and clean. Make sure you get those questions answered in Canvas and have a great day.